Mr. Hill, what has television given you?
Well, nervous dyspepsia, indigestion, heartburn, all sorts of things like that, you know.
There are moments in television history that don't just end a show, they end an era. For millions of viewers across Britain and beyond, Thursday nights had a certain rhythm. You knew what was coming, the frantic chase, the sped-up footage, that bouncy, irresistible saxophone melody flooding living rooms from Southampton to Sydney. The Benny Hill Show was not merely a program. It was an institution, a weekly ritual that had woven itself so deeply into British culture that cancelling it felt, to many, like tearing a page from the national identity itself. But on the 1st of May, 1989, Thames Television did exactly that. After more than 2 decades of laughter, controversy, record-breaking viewership, and growing cultural friction, the plug was pulled. No farewell special. No grand send-off. Just silence where the saxophone once played. The official explanations were neat and tidy: declining ratings, rising production costs, shifting audience tastes. But those who watched closely knew that the story was far messier, far more human, and far more revealing about the moment Britain found itself in at the close of the 1980s. Because the cancellation of the Benny Hill Show was not simply a business decision. It was the conclusion of a long, loud, and deeply personal cultural argument, one that had been building for years and that one infamous sketch had helped ignite. To understand how it all collapsed, you need to understand how it all began. Alfred Hawthorne Hill was born on the 21st of January, 1924, in Southampton, Hampshire. From the very beginning, performance was in his blood, not through his father, who ran a surgical appliance shop, but through his grandfather, Henry Hill, who had been a circus clown. That lineage matters. Benny Hill did not drift into comedy. He was pulled toward it by something older and deeper than ambition. His early years were defined by restlessness. He worked at Woolworths, drove milk floats, operated bridges, played drums in small bands, and took whatever work kept him moving. But movement, it turned out, was exactly the education he needed. Every job, every character he encountered, every awkward social situation fed the comedic instincts quietly developing behind that mischievous grin. The real turning point came during World War II. Called up in 1942, Hill trained as a mechanic with the Royal Electrical and Mechanical Engineers, later serving as a truck driver and searchlight operator. His deployment to Normandy in September 1944 placed him at the heart of one of history's most consequential military campaigns. But the chapter that would shape his future most profoundly came when he transferred to the Combined Services Entertainment Division, the branch of the military dedicated to keeping Allied troops laughing. In makeshift theaters and muddy fields, Hill learned to read a room, to hold silence and then break it, to make men forget, even briefly, what surrounded them. That is not a skill you learn in a studio. That is a skill forged under pressure. He adopted his stage name, Benny, as a tribute to Jack Benny, the American comedian famous for his deadpan delivery and immaculate timing. Both qualities would become hallmarks of the British comedian who borrowed his hero's name and made it immortal. On the 15th of January, 1955, the Benny Hill Show premiered on the BBC. British television would never quite be the same. The format drew heavily from the tradition of music hall entertainment, that vibrant, rowdy, wonderfully undignified world of variety performance that had defined British popular culture for generations. Hill blended live sketches with pre-recorded segments, slapstick with sharp wordplay, physical absurdity with surprisingly sophisticated parody. He surrounded himself with gifted collaborators. Patricia Hayes, Jeremy Hawke, and the irreplaceable Jackie Wright, a small, bald, endlessly patient figure whose stoic reactions to Hill's relentless head-slapping became one of British comedy's most beloved running gags, all helped shape the show's identity. Co-writer Dave Freeman was a crucial creative partner throughout the BBC years, helping Hill refine and sharpen his material into something consistently brilliant. In 1969, the show made a decisive move to Thames Television, and everything accelerated. Rather than weekly episodes, the program shifted to one-hour specials, longer, more elaborate productions that gave Hill room to breathe, experiment, and expand. The results were extraordinary. The show was eventually broadcast in over 140 countries. In 1971, viewer numbers in Britain alone climbed above 21 million. Emmy Award nominations followed in 1980 and 1981 for Outstanding Variety Programming. A BAFTA for Best Writer came in 1972. The prestigious Rose d'Or arrived in 1984. At its peak, The Benny Hill Show was one of the most watched comedy programs on the planet. The chase sequences, those frenetic, undercranked sprints set to Boots Randolph's Yakety Sax, later voted the #1 TV theme in a 2015 ITV special, became globally recognized. The characters, from the pompous Fred Scuttle to the hapless everyman figures Hill inhabited with such ease, were beloved across languages and continents. But success on that scale always carries a shadow. And through the 1980s, that shadow was growing longer. By the time the 1980s arrived, the world Benny Hill had built his career in was undergoing serious transformation. The introduction of Hill's Angels, the dance troupe of young women who became central to the show's visual identity, had added glamour and energy to the program, but it had also sharpened the critical eye being turned on the show's treatment of women. The sketches had always featured what Hill and his defenders described as harmless, cheeky fun, women in costumes, women being chased, women as the object of comic pursuit. For decades, that formula had landed without serious controversy. But context changes meaning. What one generation experiences as innocent pantomime, another can recognize as something more troubling. In the late 1980s, a particular sketch aired that crystallized every concern critics had been voicing for years. Set up as a parody of a beauty pageant, it featured the familiar ingredients of the Hill playbook: women presented for ogling, exaggerated male desire played for laughs, the objectification of female bodies treated as the natural punchline. But the sketch pushed harder than usual. The jokes were cruder. The framing was less playful and more leering. Even viewers who had previously given the show the benefit of the doubt found themselves uncomfortable. What made it significant was not that it was uniquely worse than anything that had come before. What made it significant was the moment it landed in. British society in 1987 and 1988 was engaged in a genuine, urgent conversation about how women were treated, in workplaces, on streets, in media. Feminist voices were no longer speaking from the margins. They were speaking from newspapers, television studios, and parliamentary chambers. The cultural permission that had once protected Hill's comedy had quietly expired. The sketch became a focal point. Not a smoking gun, exactly, but a symbol, evidence that could be held up and examined. And it was examined. The most prominent and damaging voice in the attack on the Benny Hill Show belonged to Ben Elton, a comedian who had emerged from the alternative comedy scene that had been consciously positioning itself against everything Hill represented. In 1987, Elton went public with his accusations, first on the television program Saturday Live, then in an interview in Q magazine published in January of that year. His argument was direct and provocative. The Benny Hill Show, he claimed, contributed to a culture that made women feel unsafe. By depicting women as objects of pursuit, by turning the male chase into comedy, the show, in Elton's view, helped normalize attitudes that had real-world consequences. The response was immediate and fierce on both sides. Defenders of Hill argued that the logic was absurd. Blaming a comedy show for social ills made no more sense than blaming concert pianists for unrelated crimes. A writer in The Independent described Elton's attack as resembling the spectacle of watching an elderly uncle being knocked down by young aggressors, excessive, disproportionate, and lacking in basic fairness toward a man whose worst offense was being old-fashioned. There was something to that argument. Benny Hill was not a cruel man. By all accounts, he was thoughtful, generous toward his cast and crew, and genuinely devoted to the craft of making people laugh. The women who worked with him regularly spoke of his professionalism and warmth. The humor was never intended to harm anyone. It emerged from a tradition of British working-class comedy that had its roots in the music hall and seaside postcards, in the cheerful vulgarity that had always been one strand of this country's comedic DNA. But intent and impact are different things. And in the late 1980s, the impact of the show was being weighed differently than it had ever been before. Elton himself later acknowledged the complexity of the moment. In a remarkable piece of self-awareness, he participated in a sketch on Harry Enfield and Chums in which he was caricatured as Benny Elton, a humorless, politically correct figure chased by furious women to the sound of yakety sax. It was a pointed joke, and not entirely at Hill's expense. Even Elton seemed to understand that he had, perhaps, pushed the argument too hard in certain directions. But the damage to the show's reputation was already done. And the Broadcasting Standards Council, taking note of the shifting climate, added its own institutional weight to the question, acknowledging publicly that comedy which had once been broadly accepted was now increasingly viewed as offensive and incompatible with contemporary standards. While the cultural battle raged in public, Thames Television was doing its own quiet calculations. The numbers told a complicated story. The show had been a genuine commercial triumph, earning the network an estimated £26 million over its run, driven largely by its extraordinary success in the American syndication market. But by the late 1980s, that golden period was drawing to a close. Viewership in Britain had been declining for several years. The audience that had once made the Benny Hill Show one of the most watched programs in the country had fragmented, pulled toward newer shows, newer comedians, a newer sensibility. The alternative comedy movement that had produced Elton, as well as voices like Alexei Sayle and the team behind The Young Ones, had fundamentally changed what British audiences expected from television comedy. It was sharper, angrier, more politically engaged. Compared to that energy, Hill's formula looked like a relic. At the same time, the show had become extraordinarily expensive to produce. Each episode was costing approximately £450,000, a figure equivalent to well over £1 million in today's money. For a network facing declining ratings and a shifting advertising landscape, that cost was increasingly difficult to justify. The equation that had once made the Benny Hill Show a commercial no-brainer had reversed itself entirely. In late May 1989, the decision was made official. Thames Television would not be renewing the show. Hill departed after 21 years. There was no ceremony. No final curtain call. Just the quiet closing of a chapter. Benny Hill did not disappear quietly. He continued working, continued planning, continued believing that there was still an audience for what he did. In 1991, he began developing a project called Benny Hill's World Tour, a concept built around taking his comedy to the international audiences who had loved him most. The project struggled from the start, and Hill completed only a single special, Greetings from New York, featuring familiar faces including Henry McGee, Bob Todd, and Sue Upton. It would eventually be released on DVD and marketed as his final television appearance. His personal life, as it had always been, remained intensely private. Hill had never married, having twice proposed and twice been turned down, including, as actress Annette Andre later revealed, a proposal she had declined in the early 1960s. He lived modestly, renting rather than owning property, walking rather than taking taxis, patching his clothes rather than replacing them. For a man who had earned millions and entertained hundreds of millions, he inhabited a life of remarkable simplicity. Then, on the morning of the 20th of April, 1992, Benny Hill was found dead in his flat in Tennington. He had died quietly in his armchair, watching television, from coronary thrombosis. He was 68 years old. His body was discovered 2 days later, after friends and colleagues could not reach him by telephone. The day he died, a new contract from Central Independent Television had arrived through his letterbox. He was buried at Hollybrook Cemetery in Southampton, close to where his story had begun. His estate, valued at nearly £7.5 million, was left primarily to family, divided among his nieces and nephews, since the parents he had originally named in his will had long since passed away. History has a way of complicating the verdicts that feel most certain in their own time. The cancellation of the Benny Hill Show felt, in 1989, like a clear cultural reckoning, old comedy giving way to new values, a corrective delivered by a society coming to terms with itself. And there was genuine truth in that reading. But time has also been kinder to Hill than his critics might have expected. In November 2021, That's TV announced that the Benny Hill Show would return to nationwide British television for the first time in nearly 20 years, as part of the network's Christmas schedule. Audiences responded with something close to affection, not necessarily for everything the show represented, but for what it embodied, a particular kind of energy, a commitment to making people laugh, a style of comedy that, whatever its flaws, came from a place of genuine craft and genuine love for the audience. The sketch that helped bring the show down remains exactly what it was, a symptom of a comedy that had stopped evolving, a moment that crystallized legitimate concerns about how women were portrayed on screen, and a reminder that cultural context is not static. What lands as harmless fun in one decade can land very differently in another. But Benny Hill himself was more than any single sketch. He was a performer who had fought his way up from milk rounds and Woolworth's counters, through wartime fields and amateur stages, to the summit of global television. He made the world laugh. That, in the end, is the thing that lasts. The saxophone still plays. And somewhere, someone is still laughing.